My name is Mark. When I was 20, I spent a summer working at a beachfront restaurant on the Outer Banks. Most nights I got off around 11 p.m., and because I lived only a few blocks from the water, I'd usually walk the beach before heading home. One Thursday in July, a coworker named Hannah asked if I wanted to hang out after our shift. We weren't dating or anything, but we'd been getting along really well. The plan was simple: grab some food after work, sit on the beach, and watch the waves for a while. Around midnight, we carried our drinks down a wooden access path and found a quiet stretch of sand. The weather was perfect, no wind, hardly any people, just the sound of the ocean. For the first hour, everything was great. We talked about work, college, mutual friends. Eventually, the conversation died down, and we just sat there listening to the waves. That's when Hannah suddenly asked me a question. "Did that guy leave?" I looked around. "What guy?" She pointed toward the dunes. "There was somebody standing over there." I followed her finger but couldn't see anything. The dunes were almost completely black. I laughed and told her she was probably seeing things. She laughed too and admitted it might have been a beach sign. The moment passed. Or so I thought. About 20 minutes later, I got up to throw away an empty drink bottle. As I walked toward the access path, I noticed footprints, a lot of footprints. They weren't unusual by themselves. What bothered me was where they were. The tracks ran parallel to us along the dunes. Whoever made them had been moving back and forth behind us for quite a while. I stared at them for a few seconds before returning to Hannah. I didn't mention it. I didn't want to freak her out. Around 1 a.m., we decided to leave. As we walked back toward the access path, Hannah grabbed my arm, hard. I remember looking down at her hand before following her gaze. At the top of the dune stood a person, just standing there, motionless, watching us. The distance made it impossible to see their face. I called out, no response. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't react at all. After a few seconds, I convinced myself it was probably someone drunk. We hurried back to my truck and left. The entire drive home, I kept checking my mirrors. Nothing followed us. By the next morning, I felt stupid for being so uneasy. Then Hannah texted me. She asked if I'd been outside her apartment the night before. I immediately called her. She sounded terrified. Around 3 a.m., she'd heard footsteps outside her window. When she looked out, someone was standing near the parking lot, just watching the building. I asked if she got a good look at them. She said no. It was too dark, but she was convinced it was the same person from the beach. I told her it was probably a coincidence. I didn't believe that myself. A few days passed. Nothing happened. Then on Monday, I got called into the restaurant manager's office. He looked genuinely confused. Sitting on his desk was a sealed envelope. My name was written on the front. Inside were photographs. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then my stomach dropped. The photos were of Hannah and me on the beach. There were at least 15 of them. Some had clearly been taken from the dunes. Others looked much closer, close enough to see our faces, close enough to hear our conversations if the person had been standing there. The manager asked if it was some kind of joke. I told him it wasn't. The police took the photographs, but there wasn't much they could do. There were no fingerprints, no return address, nothing useful. For a while, things settled down. Then about 2 weeks later, Hannah quit. She wouldn't tell anyone why. Months afterward, I ran into her at a grocery store. I finally asked what happened. She hesitated before answering. Apparently, she'd never told me everything. The morning after those photographs arrived, she found something attached underneath her car, a small GPS tracker. The police removed it. She didn't want to scare me at the time, so she kept it to herself. I asked whether they ever figured out who put it there. She shook her head. To this day, nobody knows who photographed us that night. Nobody knows who was standing on the dune. And nobody knows how long he'd been watching before we ever noticed him. The worst part is something I realized years later. The first photograph in that envelope wasn't taken the night Hannah and I went to the beach. It was taken 6 days earlier. I was alone in it. My name is Austin. A few years ago, my friends and I accidentally stumbled onto something at a beach that I don't think we were ever supposed to see. I was 21 at the time and spending a week in Gulf Shores, Alabama with 3 friends from college. We rented a small condo right on the water. Nothing fancy, but it was close enough to the beach that we could hear the waves from the balcony. Most nights we'd stay out late. One particular night started exactly like the others. We spent the evening at a beach bar, had a few drinks, and eventually wandered back toward the shoreline around 1 a.m. The beach was practically empty, a few distant lights from hotels, a couple sitting near the water. That was about it. My friend Tyler suggested we walk farther down the coast where things were quieter. Nobody objected. The 4 of us started walking. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. We talked about random college memories and laughed at old stories. Then Tyler suddenly stopped. "Do you guys see that?" About 100 yards ahead of us was a light. At first I thought it was a flashlight. Then I realized it wasn't moving. It sat low to the ground near the dunes, just glowing. One of my friends joked that it looked like a campsite. The problem was camping wasn't allowed anywhere on that beach. We kept walking. The light disappeared. Just switched off. No movement. No warning. Gone. We all noticed it. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. Then we laughed it off and continued down the beach. About 10 minutes later, we passed the spot where the light had been. There was nothing there. No chair. No cooler. No footprints that we could see. Nothing. That was weird enough, but we still weren't worried. Then we heard an engine. It was faint, a low mechanical hum somewhere behind the dunes. The sound only lasted a few seconds before stopping. Tyler immediately thought it was a golf cart. I agreed. That explanation made sense, at least at the time. We continued walking. A few hundred yards later, we noticed another light. This one was farther inland near a dune access path. The second we looked at it, it shut off. Exactly like the first one. By now, we were paying attention. The atmosphere had changed. The beach suddenly felt a lot less empty than it looked. We turned around and decided to head back toward town. As we walked, I kept looking over my shoulder. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were people standing near the dunes. At least 3 of them. Maybe more. They weren't moving. They weren't talking. Just standing there. Watching. The distance made it impossible to see their faces. I pointed them out to the others. Nobody had a good explanation. We picked up our pace. The figures remained where they were. Eventually we reached a section of beach with more hotels and more people. The silhouettes disappeared from view. We all agreed the situation had been creepy, but that was it. Nothing happened. Or so we thought. The next morning we woke up to police activity all over the beach. Several patrol vehicles. Officers speaking with hotel staff. Yellow tape near one of the dune access points. Curious, we walked over. An officer stopped us and told us to stay back. I asked what happened. He wouldn't give details. Later that afternoon, we learned the story from a local news station. Sometime during the night, police had discovered a hidden camp inside the dunes. According to the report, multiple people had been living there illegally for weeks. The camp wasn't visible from the beach. It had been built deep inside the vegetation. The officers found generators, coolers, sleeping bags, even lookout positions facing the water. That immediately reminded me of the lights we'd seen. But it got worse. Much worse. The report mentioned that several tourists had recently complained about personal items disappearing from hotel rooms and parked vehicles. Police believed the camp's occupants were responsible. Apparently, they would move along the beach at night looking for opportunities, watching people, learning routines, identifying which condos were vacant, which tourists were intoxicated, which vehicles were left unlocked. I remember feeling uneasy, but then Tyler said something that made all of us go quiet. The first light. The one we'd seen at the beginning of the walk. It wasn't near random dunes. It was directly across from our condo building. That realization hit all of us at the same time. Someone had likely been watching our section of beach before we ever started walking. We checked out 2 days later and went home. I forgot about the whole thing. Until 3 months later. One evening, Tyler called me. He sounded nervous. He told me he'd found something while cleaning out his suitcase from the trip. Something that had somehow gotten wedged underneath the lining. At first he thought it was a coin. It wasn't. It was a small plastic tag, dirty and scratched up from sand. Attached to it was a strip of faded tape. Tyler sent me a photo. The moment I saw it, I felt sick. It looked exactly like one of those tracking devices people hide inside vehicles or luggage. Maybe it was unrelated. Maybe it wasn't. But I've never been able to shake the feeling that whoever was living in those dunes wasn't just watching random tourists. I think they were choosing them. And for one night, my friends and I happened to notice them before they made their choice. My name is Zach. The creepiest thing that's ever happened to me took place during a beach bonfire that wasn't supposed to happen in the first place. I was 22 and spending a long weekend with a few friends in a rental house near Myrtle Beach. There were 6 of us total, and after a day of swimming and drinking, someone suggested we sneak down to the beach after midnight and have a small bonfire. Technically, it wasn't allowed. That was part of the appeal. Around 12:30 a.m., we carried a cooler, some firewood, and a couple folding chairs down to a secluded stretch of beach about a mile from the nearest public access point. The area was surprisingly empty. No other fires, no fishermen, nobody walking dogs, just us. For the first hour, everything was great. We sat around the fire telling stories and drinking beer. The waves were calm and the weather was perfect. At one point, my friend Derek pointed toward the water. "There's somebody out there?" Everyone looked. Roughly 50 yards offshore, we could make out what looked like a small light floating on the ocean. It wasn't moving. It wasn't getting closer. It just sat there. One of the girls joked that it was probably a boat. That explanation seemed reasonable. Nobody thought much about it. A while later, I happened to glance back toward the water. The light was gone. I didn't think much of that either. Boats move. Simple as that. Then Derek noticed something else. Footprints. There was a single set leading from the dunes toward the edge of our bonfire. The strange part was none of us remembered seeing anyone approach. We had been facing the beach the entire time. The tracks looked fresh, as if someone had walked right up to us, then turned around and left. We all got a little uneasy after that. Still, there were plenty of explanations. Maybe another group had been there before us. Maybe someone had passed through while we weren't paying attention. The conversation shifted elsewhere. About 20 minutes later, one of the girls excused herself to use the restroom back at the rental house. My friend Derek offered to walk with her. The 2 of them disappeared down the beach. The rest of us stayed behind. 10 minutes later, Derek came sprinting back. I've never forgotten the look on his face. He looked genuinely terrified. Before anyone could ask what happened, he pointed toward the dunes behind us. "There's somebody up there." We all turned. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, I spotted the silhouette. A person standing on top of the dune, completely motionless, watching us. Nobody spoke. The figure just stood there. The distance made it impossible to see any details. I finally shouted something. No response. The person didn't move, didn't react. Nothing. After about 15 seconds, the silhouette slowly stepped backward and disappeared behind the dune. That was enough for us. We immediately started putting out the fire. Nobody wanted to stay anymore. As we packed everything up, I noticed something sticking out of the sand near one of our chairs. It looked like a piece of plastic. I picked it up. It was a disposable camera, an old-fashioned one, the kind you almost never see anymore. I figured somebody had lost it. Without thinking much about it, I tossed it into our cooler. We returned to the rental house and forgot about it, at least for the night. The next morning, curiosity got the better of us. There was a pharmacy nearby that still developed disposable cameras. I dropped it off. A few hours later, I picked up the photos. There were 27 pictures. The first few were random shots of the beach. Nothing unusual. Then the images changed. My stomach dropped as I flipped through them. Every single remaining photo had been taken at night. Most were of strangers sitting on the beach, couples, groups of friends, people around bonfires. Some photos were clearly taken from the dunes. Others were much closer, close enough that the subjects would have noticed if they'd turned around. The final 3 photos were the worst. They were of us, taken that same night. The first showed us arriving with our cooler. The second showed us sitting around the fire. The third had been taken less than 20 feet away. You could clearly see our faces, our drinks, everything. I immediately called the others. Nobody had an explanation. The timestamp printed on the photos showed that picture had been taken nearly 40 minutes before Derek spotted the figure on the dune. Whoever took those photos had been standing near us for almost an hour without being noticed. The police took the camera, but nothing ever came from it. No fingerprints, no suspects, nothing. A few weeks later, I thought the whole thing was behind me. Then Derek called. He had been scrolling through social media when he found an account with no profile picture and no posts. The account had exactly one image saved in its highlights. It wasn't public anymore by the time I checked. But Derek had taken a screenshot. The photo showed our bonfire from out on the water, farther away than the beach, farther away than the dunes, almost as if it had been taken from a boat. In the corner of the image was a timestamp, the exact same time we had first noticed that strange light floating offshore. To this day, I don't know what was out there that night. I just know someone was watching us from the beach, and someone else was watching us from the water.